What if I told you that one of the most extraordinary political stories in African history didn't start in a boardroom or a parliament or even a palace? It started in a jail cell. It started with a young man sentenced to die, who stood in front of the very court that condemned him, looked his executioners dead in the eye, and instead of begging for his life, he delivered a speech so powerful, so raw, so fearless, that it broke the entire country open. And 3 weeks later, those same soldiers who arrested him broke him out of jail and handed him the country. This is the story of Jerry John Rawlings, flight lieutenant, revolutionary, convicted traitor, executed former rulers, president, and ultimately, one of Africa's most complicated, most debated, and most unforgettable leaders. You want to talk about a rise to power? There has never been anything quite like this. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, subscribe right now because today we are diving deep. We're talking about a man who failed a coup, got sentenced to death, gave a speech that shook a nation, got broken out of prison by his own army, and then ran the country for nearly 2 decades. Ghana, West Africa, 1979. This is where it begins. Let's get into it. Before we get to the coups, the executions, the radio addresses, and the revolution, we have to understand the man. Because Jerry Rawlings didn't come from nowhere. His story started long before that courtroom speech that changed everything. Jerry John Rawlings was born on June 22, 1947, in Accra, Ghana's capital city. His background was unusual for the time, and honestly, that unusualness would follow him his entire life. His mother was an Iwe woman from Ghana's Volta region, a strong, grounded woman who would raise him largely on her own. His father was a Scottish chemist from Castle Douglas in Scotland. The two had met in Ghana, but the relationship didn't last. When Rawlings was still a young boy, his father returned to the United Kingdom, leaving his mother to raise him alone. That mixed heritage, half Ghanaian, half Scottish, meant Rawlings existed in a complicated in-between space in a society where identity mattered deeply. He was neither fully claimed by one world nor fully understood by the other. And if you know anything about people who grow up in that space, you know it can either break them or forge them into something fierce. For Rawlings, it forged him. He attended Achimota School in Accra, one of the most prestigious educational institutions in all of West Africa. This wasn't just any school. Achimota had produced prime ministers, presidents, academics, and intellectuals from across the continent. Young Rawlings walked those corridors alongside the children of Ghana's elite. He watched how power worked up close. He understood it, and crucially, he began to question it. Even as a teenager, those who knew Rawlings described him as intense, passionate, somebody who felt things deeply and didn't have much patience for pretense or hypocrisy. He had a temper, he had charisma, and he had a burning sense of justice, the kind that doesn't just simmer quietly, but eventually demands an outlet. That outlet came in 1968, when Rawlings enrolled in the Ghana Air Force. He had dreamed of flying since he was a boy, and now he was going to make that dream real. And here's the thing, he was extraordinary at it. In 1969, after completing his flight training, Jerry Rawlings graduated and won the coveted Speedbird Trophy, awarded to the best cadet of his class. This wasn't a participation ribbon, this was the top honor. He didn't scrape through, he excelled. Rawlings was commissioned as a pilot officer, and over the next several years he moved steadily through the ranks. He became known throughout the Air Force for his exceptional skill in aerobatics, the kind of flying that demands absolute precision, nerves of steel, and a total command of the aircraft. By 1978, he had risen to the rank of flight lieutenant. On paper, things looked good for Jerry Rawlings. Decorated aviator, rising military career, promising future. But underneath that uniform, something was burning. Because while Rawlings was flying planes, his country was falling apart, and the men in charge were letting it happen. To understand why Jerry Rawlings did what he did, you have to understand what Ghana looked like in the 1970s. Because this wasn't just bad governance, this was a country on its knees. Ghana's post-independence story had started with such promise. When Kwame Nkrumah led the country to independence in 1957, it was the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from colonial rule. The world watched. Africa celebrated. Ghana was supposed to be the blueprint, the proof that Africans could govern themselves, build institutions, and create prosperity. But by the 1970s, that promise had curdled into something ugly. Ghana had lurched from coup to coup, military regime to military regime, each one claiming it would restore order, each one ultimately serving itself. By the time Rawling was coming of age as an officer, the country was under the grip of the Supreme Military Council, the SMC, a military junta that had started as the National Redemption Council before rebranding. At its helm for most of this period was Colonel Ignatius Kutu Achiampong, who had seized power in a 1972 coup, promising discipline and redemption. He delivered neither. Under Achiampong, corruption became the operating system of the Ghanaian state. Contracts were awarded to political allies. State resources were looted. Senior officers lived in luxury while the population scraped to survive. Achiampong himself became notorious for a system locals called kalabule, a thriving black market where basic goods that had disappeared from official shelves could be obtained at wildly inflated prices, enriching those connected to the regime. And the numbers told the full horror of the story. By 1979, food prices in Ghana were 13 times higher than they had been in the mid-1960s. Let that sink in. 13 times. Annual inflation was estimated at around 500%. 500%. The currency was collapsing. Essential commodities, the kind of things ordinary people need just to survive, had simply vanished from store shelves. You couldn't find them. Not unless you knew the right people, paid the right prices, moved in the right circles. For the vast majority of Ghanaians, daily life had become a grinding, exhausting, humiliating struggle. People were hungry. Literally hungry. In the army's barracks, Rawling saw it every day. He watched junior soldiers, men who had sworn to protect their country, going home to families that couldn't eat properly. He watched the senior officers, the big men, as they were called, living large, throwing parties, driving imported cars, while the men under their command could barely afford their children's school fees. It ate him alive. In the last 4 months of 1978 alone, around 80 strikes erupted across all sectors of Ghana's economy, the rage of ordinary workers spilling out onto the streets. General Akufo, who had overthrown Achiampong in 1978 in an internal military coup, promising to do better, declared a state of emergency in November of that year and fired over 1,000 striking civil servants in an attempt to quell the unrest. Fired them. For striking, for daring to protest. By January 1979, the SMC finally agreed to lift its ban on political parties and schedule elections for mid-1979, promising to return the country to civilian rule. But for many Ghanaians, and especially for the junior soldiers watching from the barracks, these promises rang hollow. The men at the top had promised reform before. They always promised reform. And they always delivered more of the same. Rawling, now 32 years old, had seen enough. He was done waiting. He was done hoping that the big men would change on their own. Something had to break, and he was going to be the one to break it. Rawling wasn't acting alone, and he wasn't acting impulsively, at least not entirely. By the late 1970s, there was a network operating in the shadows of Ghana's military. A clandestine group of junior officers and intellectuals who called themselves the Free Africa Movement. These weren't just disgruntled soldiers venting over drinks. These were men with a vision, a Pan-Africanist revolutionary vision inspired by the writings of Karl Marx, Mao Zedong, and Frantz Fanon. Men who believed that the corrupt regimes of West Africa needed to be swept away, and that a new, unified Africa, an Africa that truly served its people, could be built from the ground up. The Free Africa movement was organized in part by Army Major Kojo Bawakye John, and Rawlings had become heavily involved. Late-night sessions, secret meetings, heated debates about colonialism, capitalism, and the radical change they believed was necessary. They read, they argued, they planned. But the original plan of the FAM was patient. The idea was that these junior officers would rise through the ranks over years, accumulate power legitimately, and then, when they held senior positions, coordinate a revolution from within the system. It was a long game. Jerry Rawlings was not built for the long game. As Ghana's crisis worsened through 1979, as the hunger deepened and the suffering continued, and the elections being promised felt more like a stalling tactic than genuine reform, Rawlings's patience reached its breaking point. He looked around at the men in his circle, the ones still debating and theorizing while people starved, and made a decision. He was going to act. Now. On the morning of Tuesday, May 15, 1979, Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings launched his coup. He and a small band of trusted soldiers moved through the pre-dawn darkness of Accra with purpose and fury. They made their way to the Air Force Base, overpowering the base guards, seizing the armory, commandeering armored vehicles and weapons. They took control of the base communications center. They arrested senior military officers who were caught entirely off guard at that hour. It was swift, it was bold, and for a brief moment, it actually looked like it might work. But here is where the plan began to unravel. Rawlings had alerted a close confidant, Lieutenant Bawakye John, of his intentions days before. He needed wider support. He needed the network. But Bawakye John, who felt the timing was premature, refused to join the coup on that night. Too soon, he said. Not enough men. Not enough preparation. Rawlings pushed ahead anyway. In what must have been a desperate gamble, Rawlings drove his men to the Army's 5th Battalion barracks in Accra, where Bawakye John was posted, in a last-ditch effort to force his hand in the final moments, to look his comrade in the eye and say, "We are doing this. Are you with me or not?" Bawakye John was not at the barracks. Rawlings, furious and running out of time, reportedly slammed his G3 rifle to the ground in anger. The loaded rifle discharged. The gunshots shattered the pre-dawn silence of the barracks. Soldiers awoke. Alarms were raised. Confusion and panic spread through the camp. The element of surprise, the one tactical advantage Rawlings's small force had, was gone in an instant, blown apart by an accidental gunshot fired in frustration. And then the dominoes kept falling. The rebels had seized a Ferret Scout armored car as part of their plan to hold strategic locations around the city. But the driver of that vehicle, crucially, had never been told what the mission actually was. When the shots rang out and chaos erupted, the driver realized something was terribly wrong. He made a split-second decision. He steered the armored car deliberately into a ditch, immobilizing it, effectively sabotaging one of the coup's key assets from the inside. The coup was collapsing. Rawlings and his remaining loyal airmen fell back to the Air Force Station and lay low as daylight broke over Accra. But it was over. The 5th Battalion mobilized loyal forces to hunt them down. A detachment of soldiers led by Major Sadu Mahama was dispatched specifically to find Rawlings. They found him. Cornered, outnumbered, outgunned, Rawlings was arrested that same morning. Major Mahama reportedly seized Rawlings's pistol, struck him with it, and delivered what has since become one of the most quoted lines of that entire era. "You don't stage coups with a pistol." It was over. The failed flight lieutenant was in chains. He and 6 co-conspirators were charged with treason and mutiny, offenses that in Ghana's military law carried a single punishment: death. Now, this is the moment. This is the part of the story where Jerry Rawlings stopped being just another failed coup maker and became something else entirely. The trial of Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings opened in late May 1979 at Burma Hall inside the Accra military barracks. General Akufo's regime had made this a public court-martial, a deliberate choice, designed to make an example of Rawlings, a public spectacle of justice that would send a warning to anyone else in the military ranks who might be entertaining similar thoughts. But here is where Akufo made his fatal miscalculation. When you open your courtroom to the public and put a man like Jerry Rawlings on the stand, you have to be prepared for what he might say. Because Rawlings, even in chains, even facing a firing squad, was not going to go quietly. The regime threw the doors open, and thousands of ordinary Ghanaians flooded in. They crammed the galleries of Burma Hall, pressing against each other, hungry to get a look at this rebellious young officer. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. From the very first moment, Rawlings defied expectations. When the tribunal asked whether he wished to be tried separately from his subordinates, a common legal concession offered to the ringleader of a conspiracy, Rawlings refused. "I want to be with my men." 5 words, simple, delivered without hesitation, and the courtroom erupted. Wild applause from the packed gallery. Because in those 5 words, Rawlings had already communicated something profound. This man was not going to save himself at the expense of others. This man had a code. But what came next was something nobody in that courtroom was prepared for. Rather than defending himself, rather than pleading for mercy, rather than playing the legal game, Rawlings turned the courtroom into a stage. He seized the microphone of his own trial and unleashed a speech that Ghanaians would quote and debate and marvel at for generations. He did not speak like a condemned man. He spoke like a prophet. He told that court, he told those senior officers, those politicians, those businessmen sitting in judgment, that he was not there to impose himself on 10 million Ghanaian citizens, but he was there to speak truth to power, no matter what it cost him. He named his targets directly: senior officers, politicians, businessmen, foreign criminals. He accused them all of using the sweat and blood and tears of ordinary Ghanaians as fuel to enrich themselves, to, in his words, drown in wine and women, while the majority of the population struggled daily just to eat. He declared himself no economist, no lawyer, but he called himself an expert. An expert, he said, in working on an empty stomach while wondering when and where the next meal would come from. And then he said something that cut through every tribal, regional, and political division that Ghana's rulers had always exploited to keep the people fragmented. He said this was no longer a question of the military versus the civilians, no longer a question of the Akan against the Iwe, the Ga against the Northerner. It was one question, and one question only: those who have against those who have not. A question of a vast majority of hungry people against a tiny minority of greedy, inhumane, selfish men who had betrayed their country. He told the court, he told the country, that 22 years after independence, Ghanaians were still hitting their heads on the ground and leaving it all to God to save them. And then he said words that reverberated far beyond that courtroom. "Let me tell you today that God will not help you, and the big men will not help you. Only you can help yourself." The court officers struggled to maintain order. The guards tried to silence the gallery, but the applause kept coming. The hall was electric. People were moved to tears. Some stood, some shouted, because what Rawlings was saying in that courtroom, with his life literally on the line, was precisely what millions of Ghanaians had been thinking, feeling, and suffering through for years, but had never heard said out loud with such ferocity, such clarity, such fearlessness. And before he sat down, he made one final demand. He insisted that he was solely responsible for the attempted coup, that his men had merely followed his orders. He demanded they be freed. "Leave my men alone. I am responsible for everything." The verdict was inevitable. The tribunal found him guilty. Jerry John Rawlings was sentenced to death by firing squad. He would be held in a military prison pending execution. But Ghana had just heard something that could not be unheard. The trial that was supposed to silence Rawlings had instead amplified him across the entire nation. State media, perhaps not fully grasping what they were doing, reported portions of his testimony. The speech spread from city to village, from barracks to market stall, passed along by radio, by word of mouth, by the trembling voices of people who had finally heard their own pain spoken back to them by a man who was supposed to be broken. Akufo had put Rawlings on trial. He had accidentally created a legend. Rawlings sat in his cell as May turned to June of 1979, condemned, waiting. But across Ghana's military barracks, something extraordinary was happening. You see, when those words from Rawlings's trial speech swept through the ranks of the armed forces, they didn't land softly. They landed like a detonation. Because those young soldiers, the corporals and the lance corporals and the lieutenants and the enlisted men, they lived exactly the reality Rawlings had described. They had felt that hunger. They had watched those big men steal. They had served and struggled and been ignored. And now one of their own, a flight lieutenant who had dared to act, was sitting in a cell awaiting execution. That was not going to happen. In the shadows, the network began to move. Lieutenant Boachi John, the man who had refused to join Rawlings on May 15th, now felt the weight of that decision pressing down on him. He and others in the Free Africa movement made a choice. They had to move. Not months from now, not years from now. Now, before Rawlings was shot. Quietly, carefully, they began reaching out across units. At the 5th Battalion, Lieutenant Joachim Fuhr began mobilizing loyal men. Corporals Peter Tesseri and Sergeant Ado were among those who stepped up. Armored cars were identified, weapons were readied, units were synchronized. All of it done in whispers. All of it done under the noses of Akufo's regime, which was too busy preparing for its upcoming elections to notice the storm forming in its own backyard. On Monday, June 4th, 1979, the eve of Ghana's scheduled election preparations, the insurrection erupted. In the early hours of that morning, small groups of rebel soldiers moved simultaneously across Accra. Air Force loyalists regrouped at the airbase. Infantry troops at the 5th Battalion armed up and rallied. Insurgent soldiers from the Reconnaissance Regiment positioned armored cars and tanks at key points across the capital. Nobody told Rawlings. He was still in his cell at the Base Ordnance Corps guard room, still in prison, still, as far as he knew, waiting for a date with a firing squad. He woke to the sound of shooting, and then the door to his cell burst open. Standing before him were armed men in battle dress, faces sweaty, eyes wide, breathing hard. For a terrifying moment, Rawlings thought this was a trick, an assassination staged to look like an escape attempt. Government agents who would shoot him in the back the moment he started running. But then they saluted him, and they told him they were there to get him out. Rawlings, still in his prison uniform, boots still untied, was rushed out of the jail and into the wild electric chaos of a coup in full motion. And his captors drove him straight to the one place that could define everything that came next, the national radio station. At dawn, Ghanaians sitting by their radios for the morning news heard a voice they recognized, a voice that was supposed to be locked away, condemned, silenced. Jerry John Rawlings was back, and he was on the air. He spoke with barely contained urgency, breathless, intense, alive. He told the country what had happened. He acknowledged that the ranks, the junior soldiers, the men who had been suffering alongside ordinary Ghanaians, had taken action. He asked for calm. He explicitly called for no bloodshed. He emphasized, this was not about revenge. This was about justice. This was about accountability. He did not declare himself king. He did not announce a military dictatorship. He told Ghana that a new body, the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, the AFRC, would be in charge, composed of a cross-section of junior ranks, and that the scheduled elections would still go ahead as planned. And across Ghana, the reaction was something nobody in Akufo's government had anticipated. People poured into the streets, not in panic or terror, in celebration. Ordinary Ghanaians who had been ground down for years, the market women, the dock workers, the farmers, the students, they came out of their homes and their shops and they cheered. They offered food and water to the soldiers. Some of them, reportedly, even helped point out known corrupt officials hiding in their neighborhoods. The man who had been sentenced to death 3 weeks earlier was now the most powerful person in Ghana. And the question the whole continent was watching: what would he do with it? This is the part of the story where it gets complicated. Because Jerry Rawlings, the man who had inspired so much hope, who had given voice to the voiceless, who had arrived in that courtroom like a thunderclap, now had power. Real, total, unchecked power. And what he did with it would define his legacy forever. The AFRC moved quickly. True to Rawlings's word, the scheduled elections of June 18, 1979, went ahead. That was the promise, and on that promise, he delivered. But in the meantime, the house cleaning Rawlings had alluded to on that first radio broadcast was about to begin, and it would shock even those who had cheered the coup. Special military tribunals were established to try those deemed responsible for Ghana's economic devastation. And the targets were not small-time bureaucrats or mid-level officials. They were former heads of state, 3 of them. General Achiampong, the man who had ruled Ghana from 1972 to 1978 during its most catastrophic economic collapse. General Akwasi Afrifa, a former head of state from an earlier era. And General Fred Akufo, the very man Rawlings had just overthrown, still warm from the throne. These men were hauled before panels composed of junior soldiers, the very ranks they had once commanded, and convicted of capital offenses: corruption, looting the state, betraying the Ghanaian people. And then they were sentenced to death. On June 16, 1979, just 12 days after the coup, Ghana received its first shock. General Achiampong and Major General E.K. Utuka, the former Border Guards commander, were executed by firing squad. The man who had run Ghana into the ground, who had presided over 500% inflation and a nation reduced to black market survival, was dead. But the June 26th executions were the moment that shook the world. Before sunrise that morning, 6 more senior officers were brought before the firing squad in Accra. Among them was General Frederick Akufo, the head of state who had sentenced Rawlings to death just weeks earlier, and General Akwasi Afrifa, another former leader. They were joined by Rear Admiral Joy Amadume, the Navy chief, Air Vice Marshal George Yaw Boachi, the Air Force chief, Major General Robert Cote, the Army chief, and Colonel Roger Felly, the former Foreign Affairs Commissioner. 8 men in total, the cream of Ghana's military establishment, executed. Never before in Ghanaian history had former heads of state been publicly executed. Never before had a country turned so dramatically, so violently, on its own ruling class. Globally, the reaction was a mixture of shock, condemnation, and, in certain corners, a kind of grim, uncomfortable understanding. For Rawlings supporters, this was justice. Long overdue, uncompromising, revolutionary justice. The kind that didn't allow the powerful to simply retire to comfortable villas after looting a nation's treasury while ordinary people starved. For his critics, it was murder with a political costume. Decades later, Rawlings himself would make an admission that complicates the picture further. He acknowledged that some of the men executed, particularly General Afrifa, were, in his own words, innocent, victims of the moral fury of the moment. Let that sit with you for a second. The man who built his entire political identity on justice and truth later admitted that the justice dispensed in those firing squads was not perfectly aimed. That some men died who perhaps should not have. And yet, when pressed on whether he regretted the executions, Rawlings said he felt no regret. No regret. That contradiction, the man of justice who acknowledges an injustice but feels no remorse for it, is perhaps the most honest window into the complexity of Jerry John Rawlings. He was not a simple man. He was not a saint. He was a revolutionary. And revolutions, as history has shown over and over again, rarely stay clean. After the fury of June, the AFRC governed for a total of 112 days. And then, in one of the more surprising moments of his entire story, Rawlings did something that not everyone expected from a man who had just executed 3 heads of state. He kept his word. On September 24, 1979, Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings handed over power to the newly elected civilian president, Dr. Hilla Lehman, and stepped back. Ghana entered its third republic, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the trauma might be over. It was not over. President Lehman inherited a country that was exhausted, scarred, and economically shattered. The People's National Party government faced challenges that would have overwhelmed even the most experienced administration. Ghana's coffers were nearly empty. Inflation continued to rage. The essential supplies that ordinary Ghanaians needed were still desperately scarce. And slowly, agonizingly, the new civilian government began to look uncomfortably like the old ones. Whispers of corruption circulated, political appointments that smelled like the old patronage networks, economic mismanagement that produced more suffering than solutions. The euphoria of the 1979 revolution, the hope that had propelled people into the streets to cheer the soldiers, began to fade as the reality of 1980 and 1981 set in. Rawlings watched from the sidelines, and he burned. He had not given up power to watch Ghana slide back into the swamp. He had not risked execution, had not presided over firing squads, had not handed over government only to see the same cycle repeat itself. On the last day of 1981, December 31st, a date that would become forever seared into Ghana's national memory, Rawlings struck again. A small force of soldiers loyal to Rawlings moved through Accra and overthrew President Liman's government. Unlike the events of June 4, 1979, which had an element of spontaneity and rescue about it, this was planned, calculated, deliberate. And this time, Rawlings made no promises about a short stay. He assumed power as the chairman of a new ruling body called the Provisional National Defense Council, the PNDC. And he made clear from the beginning, this was not another house cleaning. This was not a temporary interlude before a handover. Ghana needed fundamental, structural, revolutionary change, and the PNDC was going to deliver it. The revolution had come back, louder, harder, and with less patience for incremental reform. Rawlings stood before the nation with the full weight of his charisma and conviction. He could mingle with dock workers and farmers without a second thought, speaking their language, sharing their frustrations, embodying their anger. The next day he could descend from a military helicopter to address enormous crowds, chanting his name. He was magnetic. He was contradictory. He was, to his supporters, something like a messianic figure, which is exactly why some of them had taken to calling him Junior Jesus. But governing is not the same as inspiring, and the PNDC, almost immediately, ran into the jagged reality of power. This is where the story darkens considerably, and it's important not to look away. By mid-1982, the PNDC was fracturing from within. The coalition Rawlings had assembled was never ideologically unified. Left-wing members of the council pushed hard for socialist policies, nationalization of industries, and closer ties with Eastern Bloc countries like the Soviet Union and Cuba. They saw Rawlings as a genuine revolutionary comrade and expected Ghana to pivot sharply left. But Ghana was bankrupt, and pragmatists within the government, including some of Rawlings's closest advisors, were arguing loudly that the country needed Western aid, needed the IMF, needed structural economic reform to survive. The tension was real, the stakes were enormous, and the atmosphere was becoming dangerous. And then came the night of June 30th, 1982, a night that would leave a permanent stain on the PNDC era. 3 high court judges, men whose job was literally to uphold the rule of law, and a retired army officer were abducted from their homes in Accra. They were seized by a group of soldiers, driven to the Bundase military shooting range on the Accra Plains, and there, in the darkness, they were shot dead. To cover their tracks, the killers poured petrol over the bodies and set them on fire. But that night, a heavy rainstorm descended over the Accra Plains. The rain partially extinguished the flames. 3 days later, a farmer stumbled upon the charred remains. The revelation sent shockwaves through Ghana and far beyond. Judges murdered by soldiers in a country where Rawlings had claimed to be restoring justice to a nation that had been robbed of it. Rawlings denied ordering the killings, but many Ghanaians and many international observers held the PNDC responsible for creating the atmosphere in which such an act could occur. When you govern through fear, when you surround yourself with armed men who believe the revolution justifies anything, you cannot always control what those men do in the name of your cause. After massive public outcry, led by the Ghana Bar Association and civil society organizations that refused to be silenced, the PNDC established a special investigations board. The inquiry eventually identified 5 primary suspects, including a PNDC member named Joachim Amarte Quay. They were tried before a national public tribunal. During the trial in June 1983, one of the accused, Lance Corporal Samuel Amadeka, escaped from prison during a failed coup attempt and fled the country. He remained a fugitive. The remaining 4 were convicted and sentenced to death, with Amarte Quay among those executed. The murders cost Rawlings dearly in terms of allies and credibility. Among those who resigned from the PNDC in protest was a relatively young political figure named John Ajekum Kufuor, a PNDC appointee who, years later, would become Ghana's president in 2001. The Chief of Defense Staff, Brigadier Joseph Nunu Mensah, also walked away. But even as these figures distanced themselves, Rawlings tightened his grip. The PNDC cracked down on dissent with increasing ruthlessness. Political detainees were held without trial. Journalists operated under the constant threat of harassment, detention, or worse. Critics of the government found themselves facing consequences that discouraged open opposition. Ghana entered what observers and historians have called a culture of silence, a suffocating atmosphere in which fear made public dissent almost impossible. For most of the 1980s, to speak against Rawlings in public was to take a very real risk. It is important to say this clearly and without softening it. The PNDC era was marked by serious, documented human rights abuses. People disappeared. People were detained without cause. People were killed. And while Rawlings was not personally responsible for every act carried out in the name of his revolution, he presided over a system in which these acts occurred and often went unpunished. That is part of the record. That is part of the man. But the story does not end there. While the human rights situation remained deeply troubling through the 1980s, something else was happening in Ghana that the world would eventually sit up and take notice of. The economy was coming back from the dead, and it happened in the most unexpected way imaginable. The revolutionary, socialist-adjacent military leader chose to embrace the International Monetary Fund. In the early 1980s, Ghana faced a genuine emergency. A devastating drought hit the country in 1983, destroying crops and further crippling an already broken agricultural sector. That same year, Nigeria, in a moment that added humanitarian crisis to economic catastrophe, expelled over 1 million Ghanaian migrant workers who had been living and working across the border. More than 1 million people, many of whom had been sending critical remittances home, were suddenly returned to a country that had no infrastructure to absorb them. The hardliners in the PNDC saw this as a moment to deepen the revolution, push further left, nationalize, control. Rawlings made the opposite choice. He signed on to an IMF-backed structural adjustment program. State enterprises that had been propped up by government money for years were privatized. Government spending was slashed to painful levels. Market reforms were implemented across the economy. Ghana opened itself up to international investment and trade on terms set significantly by Western financial institutions. To the leftists who had stood with Rawlings since the beginning, this was a betrayal of historic proportions. They had not survived coup attempts, not endured international isolation, not built a revolution to watch their leader hand the keys to the IMF. Rawlings was unmoved. "Did we have any other alternative?" he asked. And the honest answer, looking at the data, was Probably not. Ghana was not just struggling. Ghana was on the edge of collapse, and Rawlings, for all his revolutionary rhetoric, was pragmatic enough to choose survival over ideological purity. The results, over time, were undeniable. Inflation was brought under control. Industries began to revive. Infrastructure investments slowly resumed. By the late 1980s, Ghana was being held up by the World Bank as an African success story, an example of how structural reform could work in a developing economy. This is one of the great paradoxes of Rawlings's legacy. The military revolutionary who executed former heads of state and governed through fear ultimately oversaw one of the more successful economic transformations in West African history, by abandoning the ideology that had fueled his rise. History rarely gives you clean heroes or clean villains. Jerry Rawlings understood this about others. He probably understood it about himself. By the early 1990s, the world was changing fast. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Across Africa, the wave of multi-party democracy that had been building for years was becoming impossible to resist. International pressure on authoritarian regimes, from donors, from civil society, from a newly energized African public, was mounting. Rawlings read the room. In a move that surprised many who had written him off as a permanent dictator, the PNDC chairman announced a transition to constitutional governance. A new constitution was drafted, one that guaranteed civil liberties, multi-party elections, and term limits for presidents. Ghana's Fourth Republic was born in 1992. And then Rawlings did something remarkable. He resigned from the Air Force, put down the uniform, and ran for president as a civilian. He founded the National Democratic Congress, the NDC, and campaigned on his record. The economic improvements, the infrastructure, the stability that Ghana now enjoyed compared to the chaos of the 1970s. He leveraged his populist credentials, his connection to ordinary Ghanaians, and the genuine improvements in the country's fortunes. He won. In November 1992, Jerry John Rawlings became the first president of Ghana's Fourth Republic. The flight lieutenant who had been sentenced to death 13 years earlier was now the democratically elected leader of his country. It was not without controversy. Opposition parties alleged that the elections had been tilted by incumbency advantages and residual intimidation. The main opposition boycotted the parliamentary elections that followed, citing unfair conditions. But 1996 told a different story. Rawlings won re-election in an election that international observers judged to be largely free and fair. He had survived the transition from military ruler to elected president, a transition that has broken many leaders who tried it. As a civilian president, Rawlings surprised observers by tolerating a burgeoning independent press, though not without occasional harassment, and allowing opposition political activity to develop. He was no longer governing by decree and tribunal. He was governing by election, by parliament, by constitutional constraint. It was not perfect democracy, but it was democracy. And Ghana's cities began to flourish. A new middle class emerged. Infrastructure improved. Investment flowed. An entire generation of Ghanaians came of age with no personal memory of the chaotic 1970s, only the relative stability and growth of the 1990s. The constitution that Rawlings himself had championed included term limits that applied to him just as much as anyone else. And in January 2001, after serving 2 elected terms, Jerry John Rawlings walked away from power. He handed the presidency to opposition leader John Ajakum Kufuor, the same John Kufuor who had once resigned from Rawlings's PNDC in protest over the judge's murders, in a peaceful, constitutional transfer of power. Ghana, in 2001, was at peace. It was holding regular elections. Power was changing hands through the ballot box. The institutions were holding. When Rawlings first seized power in 1979, none of that was guaranteed. None of it. So how do you judge Jerry John Rawlings? This is the question that Ghanaians, and historians and political scientists, and ordinary people who lived through his era, have been wrestling with since the day he stepped down, and frankly since before that. On one side of the ledger, you have things that are genuinely impressive. A young man from a complicated background who looked at a corrupt, broken system, found the courage to challenge it when nobody else would, and paid the price willingly. A soldier who stood in a courtroom facing death and refused to compromise his dignity or his convictions. A revolutionary who, against the expectations of almost everyone, handed over power twice, once in 1979 and again in 2001. A leader who presided over a genuine economic turnaround when Ghana was on the verge of complete collapse. A man who helped build the institutions that allowed Ghana to become one of West Africa's most stable democracies. These are not small things. But on the other side of the ledger, the executions. 8 men shot dead, including 3 former heads of state, with Rawlings himself later admitting that some may have been innocent. The murdered judges of 1982, killed in the atmosphere that his rule created. The detained political opponents, the journalists silenced. The years of fear, the culture of silence that descended over Ghana and squeezed ordinary citizens who dared to disagree. How do you hold both of those things at once? The answer is, you have to, because that is the actual, honest record. And anyone who shows you only one side, who gives you Rawlings the hero or Rawlings the villain, is selling you something simpler than the truth. What Ghana got was a man of genuine conviction who was also capable of terrible things. A man who truly believed he was fighting for the powerless, who could also become the kind of power that crushes dissent. A man who gave Africa one of its most extraordinary political speeches under the threat of death, and who also oversaw the execution of men who may not have deserved it. That is Jerry John Rawlings, in full, unedited. He spent his post-presidential years as a respected elder statesman, serving as an African Union envoy to Somalia in the 2010s, remaining a vocal commentator on Ghanaian and African affairs, and continuing to speak, as he always had, with the directness and passion that had defined his entire life. On November 12, 2020, Jerry John Rawlings passed away in Accra after a short illness. He was 73 years old. Ghana declared an official national mourning period. His state funeral was held in January 2021 at Black Star Square in Accra, the same plaza where Kwame Nkrumah had declared Ghana's independence all those decades ago. Dignitaries from across Africa and around the world attended. Military jets roared overhead in a flypast. Cannons fired a 21-gun salute. For a man who had once been sentenced to death in these same barracks, for a man who had once been an inmate awaiting execution, the symmetry of it all, the guns that once condemned him now saluting him, was almost too much to process. The most powerful nations on earth can only wish for leaders who leave behind a legacy this complicated, this contested, and this impossible to simplify. And that is the story of Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings. From a prison cell to a radio station, from death row to head of state, from a pistol in a failed coup to a 21-gun salute at his funeral. If you made it to the end of this video, you are a real one. Seriously, this was a long one, and I appreciate every single minute you spent here with me. Now I want to hear from you. How do you judge Jerry Rawlings? Is he a hero, a villain, something in between? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Let's get a real conversation going. And if you found this story as fascinating as I did, do me one simple favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with somebody who loves history, loves Africa, or just loves an incredible story. We've got more deep dives coming. Stories from across Ghana, across Africa, and across the world. Stories that deserve to be told properly, with the full complexity and the full truth. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious.